What is good, YouTube? My name is Ash Porter, and today I am continuing my journey through Peter Ackroyd's Histories of England books. And this, it is volume 4, Revolution. I'm really excited about this one. Out of all of them, this is the one I was looking forward to because I think, if I understand correctly, this is going to cover something called the Glorious Revolution. Now, do I know a lot about the Glorious Revolution? Absolutely not. But I read about it in this amazing book called Why Nations Fail, and it just really sparked an interest in me because I have a feeling it's going to be all about, literally revolution in England, the rise of the lower classes, more of a level playing field where people from the lower tiers of life, in poverty, who haven't been born into wealth, can suddenly access wealth way more easier through invention, through innovation, through business. And yes, that may have always been possible, but I'm pretty sure from what I understand, the Glorious Revolution opened this up quite a lot. There's a lot to do with ownership of land and just people having more rights and having more almost personal power within England and in the world. So I'm really excited to read about it. I also think it's going to be about the Industrial Revolution and basically the rise of England more and more as a nation and a nation of power. Obviously we know it didn't turn out great in the long run and there's a lot of bad stuff done, but it's going to be a really interesting read. Plus, this one's a little bit shorter than the others, so I feel like you don't need as much stamina to get through it. I'm really excited. Peter Ackroyd's The History of England, Volume 4, Revolution. Let's dig into it. So, William of Orange has been made king, like at the end of the last book. And the one thing to note about this is Parliament had put heavy restrictions in on what it meant to be king, the power of the king. And so Parliament basically gained a lot more power and leverage over the sovereigns of England. And then, of course, like any king of England, he decided straight away, I'm going to go to war with France because that just seems to be what they do. And naturally, this puts such a heavy burden on the nation of England, both in terms of the finances, because it meant taxing the population more and more for different reasons. They also, to be fair, were taxing imports and exports, and so it wasn't necessarily wholly the English population, but then obviously there's the weight of supplying men for the war and fighting and dying and that kind of stuff. But then one interesting thing which did happen early in his reign was the formation of the Bank of England. Now, this isn't necessarily a good thing because actually it was the start of the national debt, and again, Parliament having more power. But basically what they did is they created a bank which loaned money to the king to pay for the war, and then the nation would end up paying it back with interest. And well, we're still paying for it to this day, I think. And then finally, in 1695, there was this lapse where basically there was this law meaning that the press, didn't have complete freedom and there could only be a few papers reporting news. But suddenly in 1695, it got missed out or something went wrong. And now the press had almost complete freedom. Loads more papers popped up reporting whatever they wanted, and nothing could be done about it. To be honest, the most exciting thing about today's reading was that William of Orange was killed basically by a mole. He was out hunting or something, and his horse got his foot stuck in a molehill. The horse fell over. William fell. He broke his collarbone. Apparently, it led to complications, and he died. AKA, William was killed by a mole. Anne became queen, so now got Queen Anne, and that's about it. The only other highlights really were had a chapter sort of about agriculture, and that there was this agricultural revolution that was talked about in the last book a little bit, but it started to happen. But the kind of good and bad things of this were, yes, agriculture was improving, yield was improving, there was more money in it, more profit in it, and it was helping the nation be wealthier and better off, except that some of the things happening behind the scenes were that small farmers and landowners couldn't manage. There wasn't enough profit being a small farmer anymore, and that they'd have to sell, bigger organisations, farmers would come in and that was good for large scale production, but not necessarily for those who are poor, And then finally, it also talks about the start of coal mining and the start of the early signs of the Industrial Revolution, steam engines, all that kind of good stuff. So this morning, basically read about the death of two monarchs. First of all, Queen Anne, she died, when was it? In 1714. Queen Anne died apparently from gout, though I looked it up and supposedly you can't actually die from gout, but it can cause other things that then can lead to death. But, sorry Queen Anne, RIP. The only two interesting things kind of from her reign that I picked up were, one, that reading was becoming more and more common, that the public were learning that skill more and more, one, mainly to read newspapers and keep up with gossip and that kind of stuff, but it's interesting, a growing class of readers, that's what we want to hear about, And then secondly, that at that time, this kind of satire genre was really growing, this idea of being mocking people, arguing and really putting people in their place, but with a comedic side to it. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. Just the idea that as the newspapers were growing, more and more was being written, more and more free speech, and people were able to express themselves in this new way, publicly criticizing people, calling stuff out, but also, writing in an entertaining way as well. And then George I came to the throne, and this, now we've gone from a Dutch king to a vaguely English queen to now a German king on the English throne. Apparently it was something there was 56 potential people with better hereditary claims to the throne, yet they chose him because he was the only Protestant among them. So he came, and the only summary I can say of him was he would rather have been in Germany, and he died on his way to Germany. That's about it. Thanks, George. And also, he didn't like his son, George II. A good king. But the really interesting thing was that chapter finishes basically by saying, there's not much to highlight from George himself in his reign. However, progress was being made across the nation. Technology was advancing. We were growing in wealth, in power and abundance. Almost under his nose, without the king's doing, it was happening. From what I'm reading today, there was nothing to do with kings or queens or anything. It's all to do with life within England, sort of in this period of sort of the mid-18th century onwards. And what's interesting is that this is the time period where everything that's kind of stereotypically posh English comes from. So we're talking, high society's fashion started becoming a big thing. Balls every single weekend. You're judged on what you wore, the interior, what your house was like, all this kind of stuff, and that kind of that high-end life just started to appear, and that kind of world emerged. But then equally, going alongside that, as previously mentioned, trade started to boom. England became a nation that was fundamentally built upon commerce and trade, and wealth was becoming more attainable throughout the classes and the industry, and people were moving into cities more, all this kind of stuff. One little fact I like is libraries started emerging. As there was this growing population of readers, they started letting people rent books, that kind of stuff. So the key things from today is King George II is now sitting on the throne, but once again, right, which is just the history of England, is it has a king who doesn't really like England or its people, and that feeling was kind of reciprocated, that people didn't really like him. But the one positive I will say about George and what the picture Ackroyd paints is that he actually did his job. Unlike other kings who kind of just focused on other things and hunted and partied or just went to war with other people for fun, he actually tried to do his job well. Though the one other thing against him is he has an awful reputation for treating people horrifically. Apparently he kicked servants regularly. What a weirdo. But anyway, and then England decided to go to war with Spain because England can't help but go to war with people and try and assert its power and have small man syndrome. And then the only other things were London started to become a bit of a grim place by the middle of the sort of 18th century. Like crime, especially violent crime, was really, really common. People were scared to go out at night. A gin epidemic was taken over where people were just getting addicted. It was huge. It was just causing so many problems. And also, Ackroyd tells how there's a massive rise in superstition, and this whole bit is really well done. Loads of really cool, weird stories, and again, some really great storytelling from Ackroyd. So England have now decided to take the war with France to a whole nother level. They want complete naval domination. They want to control all trade on the seas. They want to become a more and more dominant nation and power within the world, and they don't want France involved at all. So this has been taken to a whole nother level. You've got things like the slave trade absolutely starting to kick off in huge ways, and all the implications of that, basically. But then similarly at this time, you have sort of the rise of Methodism, and a famous guy called John Wesley, he's like basically travelled the world preaching. I think he used to do like 800 sermons a year. That's madness. Just travelling on horseback all around. I'm pretty sure he went all around Britain and America. Absolute madman. But then you also, alongside it, for some reason, have the rise of evangelicalism. And now don't imagine like the evangelical of what you sort of associate today in terms of that really right-wing white America, but think of like a people who take their faith seriously and put it into action. Think of, a William Wilberforce, who his faith inspires him to do everything he can to try and stop the slave trade. He didn't single-handedly do that. There was a lot of other factors, but that's the kind of evangelical you need to imagine. And then finally from today, King George II dies going to the toilet, I'm pretty sure. How he died, I do not know, but in October 1760, he died, and it's time for a new king. Good morning. So you won't know this, but I know this. I've missed a few days of reading. I've just been busy, tired, life's got in the way, and I want to say that is totally okay. That sometimes we don't always fulfill our habits completely, but it's how we react and get back on it. And so back on today, reading, and gosh, I feel like I only read 30 pages, but a lot happened today. So George III came to the throne. He didn't really like any politicians, and so kind of created a close-knit group, and that's kind of all that happened with him. But I do want to read one key line that came out of this, which I think was really important, and it says, "The countries of Europe were exhausted after 7 years of conflict, and the majority of them had gained little if anything from the bloodshed and destruction." Gosh, I can't read this morning. I think that's really important to note, because that's talking about, this war with France and Spain, all that kind of stuff, and I think it summarises a lot of war. What actual gain do people get from it? Most of the time, not a lot, just a lot of bloodshed and destruction. Really interesting point. But then I guess there are three other key things from today. So first, Samuel Johnson came up with the English dictionary, just had a love for words in the English language and started to construct this incredible thing. 2, novels and fiction started to become popular. They weren't looked down upon anymore, but people started to read, as this like growing population of readers expanded, and people started to love novels more. And then 3rd and finally, the stamp tax. So this, I don't know the ins and outs completely, but any of you guys who are American will probably have learned about this, about, the English basically tried taxing America on all their imports and exports, and America were not buzzing about it. The colonies started to rebel, and tomorrow we're going to continue reading about that. So the first thing I'm noticing today, and just a kind of theme as this book has gone on, is the talk and what the book follows is structured way less around the monarchy anymore. Like, King George was mentioned once today, and that was because he was sort of leading or trying to endorse the Revolutionary War, the King's War against America, but that was it. And mainly the talk is now about politicians, and other areas of English life, and so that's really interesting. And then you have the Industrial Revolution, sparked by many different things, but innovation, invention, the working class, the rise of people moving into the cities, a growing population and constantly expanding, people looking for cheap labour because the population is expanding so much, and also at the end of the day, a nation that on its home soil in England was at peace, and so it didn't have to worry about anything to stop it growing and changing and becoming industrial, I guess. And then the other thing to do with that is pollution was apparently very quickly noticeable because coal was being burnt. Now they discovered how efficient coal could be, and they were burning it all the time. Especially Birmingham was renowned for its horrific pollution. And then the final thing is it's the start of the Revolutionary War. Big up any of you who have watched Hamilton. That's the only reason I know anything about that war. But yeah, I'm sure I'm about to get educated a little bit more on it. But America versus Britain. Another morning of reading. I'm looking very tired, so I apologise. But 4 key things, quick fire things today. 1, Ireland won its independence, got its independence, became its own nation. 2, America properly won its independence. It had the peace treaty, and now I think it had started with 13 states, its own nation to sort out itself. Number 3, there was this like a 7-year case in Parliament against the East India Company and the head of it, and basically the people in the UK and Britain didn't want to be exploiting India and all its provinces in the way it was. Yes, they wanted the wealth and the colonies, but they realised that they were treating them horrifically, especially the East India Company was really doing bad stuff, and they were like trying to stop it. That happened. And then finally, the 4th thing that kind of started happening, but it took 45 years for anything to change, was abolitionists started popping up. After the thing with the East India Company, more people started speaking up. Hey, what about the slave trade? This thing doesn't seem quite right. But that did take a while, and I'm sure we'll get to that in later pages or even books. Whew. I've had a few days off reading this book. I'm going to be honest, it hasn't gripped me in the way I was really hoping it would. But that's okay. But today, I was reading a lot about as the Industrial Revolution really kicked off and more people were moving to the cities. Child labour was really, really bad. You had children working probably from the age of 4 onwards in pretty grim conditions, helping their families make a living, helping contribute towards the economy. But when we think about it now, that's pretty horrific. 4-year-olds working in really bad conditions, like long hours. Pretty grim. Another thing was that a good thing was that they had these like working communities, right, where people, you'd almost have your housing and meals and stuff provided for you by your employer. You'd go live somewhere specifically based on where you were working, and you'd be part of these like working communities, and they sound pretty cool. And then finally, really, it's just the rise of the Iron Age, the rise of industry, the rise of what we'd call, the Industrial Revolution, where the big cities, Birmingham, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, they were all expanding through industry, especially Birmingham. That's the one that's notorious for it. And yeah, it is really interesting. Currently, I'm at this beautiful retreat centre with a group of friends and a charity. I think I mentioned before One Life, so big up them. But this morning I was just reading a bit of continuing with this history of England, right? And George III, he's portrayed in Hamilton and in history as crazy, and I was like, oh, it's just just his personality. But from what I understand, and I was just reading, he literally went insane, was in an insane asylum, was treated like he was insane. So, but yet he was still the king. They didn't dethrone him. They didn't do anything. So George III, top insane lad. But then also we kind of covered the start of the Napoleonic Wars. I think that's what they're called, but specifically England's role in that, and just us being annoyed with France and continuing this war against them, and the fact that we kind of screwed Napoleon over, and I think it's in Alexandria, in Egypt, we ambushed him and destroyed a lot of his fleet, but he obviously recovers and goes on to do crazy stuff. But then England once again realised, you know what, war costs a lot of money and it's not worth paying for, and so those in government who actually supported the people and the country rather than just the upper class, they were like, we can't do this anymore. And so they stopped the war, they signed a peace treaty, and they carried on. Also, look at this view. This is, I mean, it's a farm, but my days, beautiful. Here we go. I am finally on the final day of reading this book, or I just finished it. I'll do an outro in a minute, but my final day, I'm going to be honest, it was about a week since the last time I read this. This book has taken me a while to read, but I got there, and this final day, basically, we're at war with Napoleon. Napoleon's just trying to take over Europe. He hates Britain. He wants it. We have naval supremacy, so that's one thing that is on our side. Despite the fact we're weak in many other areas, we still, are doing good on the seas, and that's helping us out. Then the next thing that happens is George III goes mad again, literally in a straitjacket, unable to rule. And it just sounded like, from everything Ackroyd's writing, that Britain had a shortage of good leaders, or at least good leaders that were able to get into those positions of leadership. It just sounds like we went from one poor leader to another. And I'm not just talking the monarchy, I'm talking about all these governmental leaders that we started having. They just sounded rubbish. They had a lot of flaws and made a lot of mistakes. And then finally, Napoleon messes up. He gets too greedy. He tries to take over Russia, gets caught in a Russian winter, and his army's destroyed. He goes back disgraced, resigns, tries to take power again, and England stop him. And at the end of the day, Ackroyd describes how, the English probably thought they were like peace bringers and saviours of Europe while they still dominated a lot of the world in their empire. Pretty hypocritical, but that is the history of England. And there we go. That is the History of England, Volume 4, Revolution. Now, can I be really honest with you guys? This was the one I was really excited for, and it was definitely my least favourite so far. I just couldn't get into it. You can tell I've got just three markers for quotes. I struggled reading it. It took me ages to read because I was so unmotivated to read it. Yes, I probably had a lot going on in life in the last few weeks that have distracted me, but just didn't grip me in the way I wanted it to. But I will continue on with this series in a few books' time, or a few non-fiction books' time. I will be continuing on with book 5, and it is a good series. This was just a bit of a bogey in the mix of it. But it's still worth reading about the history of England. There you go. I've been Ash Porter. Thank you so much for watching this book vlog, and I'll see you next time.